Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. Today we're discussing Chapter 7 of Stephanie Kelton's Deficit Myth, the deficits that matter. This chapter addresses the question, where are we falling short of our potential to do the best we can for the people? If we're not hung up on the deficit myth, if we're not worried about fiscal deficits, what should our priorities be? So I'm going to start us off with a quote from the book, from the chapter. Here we go. Our national infrastructure is crumbling. The cost of a college education is increasingly out of reach, and 45 million Americans are saddled with more than $1.6 trillion in student loan debt. Income and wealth inequality are near record highs. Average workers have seen their real wages increase by just 3% since the 1970s. Nearly 1 in 4 Americans can say they will never be able to afford to retire. Our healthcare system is inadequate, to say the least, with 87 million people uninsured or underinsured. So this is basically a list of things that we're kind of getting wrong, or that Stephanie Kelton feels that we're getting wrong. And I think this is reasonable. She points out at the beginning of the chapter that we have a lot of resources. We have this kind of poverty among plenty type situation. And there's, if we have the ability to not have people be poor, and people are poor, then we're doing something wrong, obviously. So the question is, which ones of these things do we think are actually problems that we want to prioritize? So for example, do we care about wages? Most people care about wages. They want workers to be paid well, that kind of thing. But we're a basic income discussion here. So if we have incomes that are high enough, maybe those incomes don't need to come from wages. And maybe that's actually a sign of, people being better off. The fact that less of their money has to come from, an employer, that kind of thing. So I think, wages, if we're imagining a basic income world, are not necessarily something we need to prioritize. It doesn't matter if wages are stagnating or going down, that can be a good sign. It means we're, pulling people away from what they would otherwise be doing less. We need less of an incentive to get them to do the work. So that's a good thing. And then in terms of inequality, we'll talk more about this later, but she makes some good points in here about inequality and political power. So people having more money kind of being able to run the show, and then the people who don't have any money really not getting much of a say in anything. So I think that's an important point. A question we can ask is, how do you address that? She advocates more progressive taxes. I'm not convinced that a more progressive tax system will really kind of get at the underlying power disparities, political power disparities. So we can talk more about that in a little bit. And healthcare system being inadequate, I think that's an important point. That's something we definitely have the resources to get right. But we also have the resources to get right just people's income in general, people's access to the market economy. And she doesn't talk about basic income in this book, but I think of the things she talks about that basic income is closest to, it's probably closest to something like universal healthcare that goes to everyone. Not forcing people to be dependent on employers for healthcare, not forcing people to be dependent on employers for incomes. So Eddie says in the chat that decreasing or stagnating wages is a cost to worker consumers, but a benefit to employers. So I wouldn't agree with that. I think if you have, it depends what variables you're holding fixed, right? Like if you hold everybody's income fixed and then a lower proportion of it is coming from wages, then that means a higher proportion of it is, no strings attached, is unconditional. And that's, people if those are the conditions, then people are unequivocally better off. The people who are the workers, or the people who would be workers, are better off. The consumers are better off because they don't have to be workers as much. That's not as much of what they have to do in order to get their money, that kind of thing. So I generally view decreasing in a basic income world, of course. I view decreasing wages as being something that corresponds with people being better off, not worse off. So there's also the issue of student loan debt, which is an interesting one. We did a whole one of these on education. Part of the problem with student loan debt and with higher education in general is that it's really tied to the whole job thing. People are desperate to get a good college education or college education, and they're willing to pay whatever amount of money they have access to in order to get that, because they trade off, right? Because it might be very expensive, but it's worth it to them because they need the jobs in order to have a successful life, in order to have in order to not get stuck and not fall into poverty. But that's also a consequence of the fact that we're living in a society where we force people to get their income from jobs. So if we weren't doing that, the amount of money that people would be willing to spend on education might be different. And people might be spending less money with the idea of credentialing in mind, and more money with the idea, or they might be putting more of their effort into actually getting educated rather than getting credentialed. It might not be as much of a priority to have the college degree or something like that, because there's all kinds of resources that are out there that can help people learn if they have the freedom, if they have the time. And of course, that requires the money to survive, or the resources to survive and not have to spend your time working at a job, that kind of thing. If you're in that situation, then there's a lot you can learn by online resources and books and even online communities and things like that. So I'm not too I think in a basic income world, I'm not too worried about something like student loan debt, because I think, and it's not just the amount of money people are desperate to spend or willing to spend, it's the amount of money that society or our institutions are willing to lend to potential students. Because if you think that, well, everybody needs a college education, we should lend them money so they can go do that, then that makes a lot more money available for them to spend. And that drives up tuitions as well too. And there's people competing for it, for the credential, and not for the education necessarily. Go ahead, Austin.
Yeah, I just want to say, in Australia, we used to say there's higher education and then there's vocational training, right? So higher education was a university where you would learn about, Socrates and the beauty of pure mathematics, and you would learn for the sake of learning. It was a sort of gentlemanly pursuit, if you will. There's a lot of baggage that goes with that too, but there was something noble about this idea that it was knowledge for knowledge's sake. And then vocational training was like, you're going to learn to be a plumber, right? But now all universities frame themselves as a kind of professional vocational training. So you're getting vocational training to be a lawyer or a manager or whatever. When I went to my university open day, I remember the guy who ran the philosophy department actually saying the reason you should do philosophy is because it's useless. Everybody else here is going to tell you how you're going to get a job and how you're going to this is going to be this really practical skill you're learning. I'm not going to tell you that. The point of philosophy is philosophy, right? And there's something really beautiful about that that's being lost. And I think that reflects a broader societal loss. Everything's a means to something else. Nothing is an end in itself. And we're all, we talk about we need to invest in our children so the economy will grow. And it's like, no, we need the economy to grow so our children will have good lives, not the other way around, right? Like everything gets turned into how can we be more productive, including knowledge and stuff, which is a great tragedy.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's there's all kinds of stuff we can explore as humans in terms of knowledge, and training people for vocations is just a tiny sliver of that. And if you're doing it for the benefit of the students, and you don't really have at the other end this real need for people to be in that vocation, that can be kind of a waste of people's time and effort. And then, yeah, there's value to discovery and exploration and just knowledge for knowledge's sake, because it's what makes life fun and interesting. Well, for some people, and if we don't, the labor market is for if you need people to do something else. If you don't need people to do something else, you can have them do what inspires them the most. So I hope basic income can help us get back to that. And I think it will. And I think there's always room for vocational training. Sometimes it makes the most sense for the businesses to train their workers themselves. But then sometimes there's, there's a collective action problem where no one wants to train the workers, and society would benefit from the workers being trained or something like that. So I think there's room for vocational training as well, but I don't think it's the answer to how to help people be prosperous in life or something, is to offer them vocational training. No, that's still something that you would want to frame in terms of serving the product of the output, serving the product of the labor, serving the output of the economy, right? You're training people so they can produce something for the people. That's the way in which it comes back to us. So let me go to the next quote here. My guess is that what people really long for are the days when a single breadwinner could support a family, buy a home, put 2 cars in the garage, send kids to college, take the family on vacation once a year, and retire with a decent pension. It comes out as bring back manufacturing jobs or make America great again, but it's really about replacing the lost sense of job security and what a middle income job was once able to provide. So I think there is some longing for the days when you could go out and earn a lot, or earn enough to have a decent life at your job, and you'd only have to have one earner per family or something. But that's partly because nostalgia. That's partly because that's the way it used to be, and it worked kind of decently for a lot of people. But that's not the ideal, right? The ideal is that nobody has to work at all ever, and people only work when they have to. And the ideal is that your income doesn't have to be tied to a job at all. Now that's unrealistic, but we want to get as close to that as you can get without kind of causing any problems in the economy or something like that. So I think we need to be careful about. She's trying to tease out, what people genuinely want versus what they're saying. But what people want is not necessarily, or what people, are even kind of intuitively longing for is not necessarily the thing that's going to be optimal for them either. So I think that's something important to pay attention to. It's not in terms of jobs, people. So I think we've talked about this before on here, that culture can adapt, and we have a culture around work, around kind of contributing and pulling your own weight and earning a living, even if it's only one person from a family. That family is contributing to society, that kind of thing. But culture can adapt. So even though people's psychology is kind of at this point wired to really need a job and feel the need to contribute and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't have to be that way. It can change if the context changes. If we create economic conditions that really don't force people to work anymore, and people can see that, they actually they need a certain amount of labor, but they don't need everyone to be working as much as they are today, or that kind of thing, then the psychology can shift and the psychology can adapt. So I think I'm okay with that. I'm okay with moving on from some of this nostalgia for the way things were. I'm all for progress into the future. And this is kind of something that comes up with MMT again and again, and with mainstream economics. They want to reach full employment, want to get everyone a job. They kind of think of that as maxing out the economy, getting the most out of the economy, is using up all your resources, that kind of thing. I'm not really as much into that. So let's go on to the next one here. The number of people with health insurance here in the US is actually on the decline because of Republican efforts to weaken the Affordable Care Act. Moreover, even people with health care coverage often strain to afford the care they need due to the inadequacy of the coverage offered. That's called the underinsurance problem. So I think there's an analogy here. There's the underinsurance problem, but there's also the under income problem or something like that. A lot of times we talk about underemployment, but what we're really complaining about is people not having enough money to live decent lives. So this is just kind of drawing the connection between healthcare and income. You kind of want both of them to be universal, except to the extent that you need to withhold some of it to provide an incentive for people to go off and work and to do some stuff. And yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about that one. There's a lot of things that we can be doing better. And I think something that's interesting about this chapter is that a lot of it isn't really about MMT. It's more about, okay, there are things that we all kind of agree on that we want to be doing better, or most people think we should have better healthcare. There might be disagreements about how we should go about that or something like that. But we all want a better society, a more prosperous society, and a more prosperous people. So that's not controversial. She's saying a lot of stuff in here that's not controversial. Some of the stuff she's saying that's not controversial is stuff I disagree with, like the stuff about employment and stuff like that. But this chapter feels less about MMT, and it feels more like, well, if you're not worried about balancing the budget, then maybe you can focus on your other priorities. And here they are. And she kind of enumerates what the different priorities are. So let's get to the next people, or the next quote here. We have told young people that the way to climb the income ladder is to go to college, that is the pathway to higher lifetime earnings and more financial security. That is no longer true. You need a college degree just to hold on to the rungs. Without it, you risk falling down the income ladder. The problem is that earnings aren't rising for people with college degrees. In fact, for 60% of college graduates, their wages today are lower than in 2000. So interesting again, kind of this default of tying income to jobs. Certainly, and then the idea that the income ladder is something you want to climb. I guess that's always going to be true. There's always going to be ways to get more money from somewhere, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be a survival thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be everybody's kind of climbing over each other to compete for survival, and the people who get to the top of the ladder get to have decent lives, and the people at the bottom are, in poverty or something like that. We don't have to have that. We can still have, kind of people competing for more money, and then the poorest person is still living a great life, and they just don't have as much money as everyone else, right? Or something like that. Just because there happens to be a poorest person doesn't mean there has to be a poor person in society. So there's actually a lot to kind of get out of this one, which is partly the idea, again, back to the idea that, college is kind of your credential that gets you the job that ties to the income. So there's a lot of links we can break there. There's the link between jobs and income, and then there's the link between college and credentials. And it's just kind of this whole thing that we can kind of rethink. We don't need to worry about people in a basic income world. You don't need to worry about people falling down the income ladder per se. Maybe there are some people who are worried about, staying rich or something like that, or being richer than their friends. But it's not like a concern that we have to worry about with economic policy. And similarly, education, at least in terms of the credentialing part, or education in general, shouldn't really be an economic policy issue. It's more of like, oh yeah, we want to provide people with enriching life experiences, and make sure they have access to that the same way we would provide entertainment or activities or anything like that. Education can be seen more as just like a benefit in itself. There's some things obviously that you want to learn for other purposes, but yeah, it doesn't have to be set up this way. So the fact that their wages today are lower than in 2000 for 60% of college graduates, that's awful. That's awful in a world where people's income depends on wages, and you have to get a college degree just to get by. It's not awful in a world where income is not tied to wages. It's a sign that we're using labor more efficiently, paying less for labor. People are naturally doing the things that you don't need to pay them as much to get them to do, because it's what they naturally want to do more. So that's a good thing, I think. Let me check here. Nobody on the YouTube. All right, I'm going to go to the next quote here. Okay. MMT's lens also shows how we could easily and quickly retire all student debt through the federal government, freeing up income that could be spent back into the economy, creating millions of new private sector jobs. Finally, the twin trends of stagnating wages coupled with increasing education requirements in job applications both result from employers holding all the cards. With MMT's tools, we can restore full employment and tight labor markets, helping return bargaining clout to workers. So a question here is, what do we want out of the labor market? Do we want it to be an efficient way of allocating the resource of labor? If that's all we want out of it, then maybe we don't care about some of the things. We don't care about like employment being tight and bargaining clout to workers or something. And the term workers, like this comes up again and again in this book and in MMT in general and in life, right? Do we really want to be thinking of people as workers? Well, I think the economy exists for the benefit of the people, and we're the people. So that means I would say that it makes more sense for us to think of ourselves as consumers first. And the idea of doing things specifically to benefit workers, well, if you're thinking of people as consumers, then a worker is just someone who you managed to create enough incentive to get them to go do something for you, right? That's what a worker is. It's just a role, right? Workers are not the same thing as people, right? That's not to say that workers aren't people. They are people, but not all people have to be workers, and the role of worker doesn't necessarily have to be the identity of people and the identity that you want to target in terms of supporting and that kind of thing. So increasing education requirements in job applications, my sense is that once the labor market is settled down, once it's more efficient and we're not trying to push everyone into jobs anymore, then some of the ridiculous, distorted looking things in the labor market are going to settle down as well, like weird job requirements that don't have anything to do with the job, that kind of thing. But it's also something that's not going to matter as much to people if they're not dependent on jobs as much. So there's this element in here of freeing up income that can be spent back into the economy, creating millions of new private sector jobs. So I always think that's a funny thing. This is like the whole stimulus argument, right? That you kind of get the economy going and then money will flow out of it to the people. That's not what we need the economy to do. We need the economy to sell you things when you come to it with the money, right? If it spits out money to people through the labor market or something like that, then maybe that's a side effect of creating an incentive for people to work. But the goal is not to stimulate the economy, to get it to do something, to give you the money so you can buy the stuff. You can short circuit. You can have a shortcut there. You can just give people the money directly so they can buy the stuff. And then it doesn't matter whether the money gets spit back out again at them or not. You can just adjust the amount of money you give them. And that's the basic income. So we have a couple of people with their hands up. Let's go to Eddie. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself. There you go.
Well, I think it's interesting that, I think Kelton has the right conclusion here that we want tighter labor markets. We want, worker consumers to have a a better negotiating position, which will lead to higher wages. But the things she proposes are not as good as UBI, I would say, at making that happen, because UBI would increase spending, and when the businesses have to hire more people to keep up with activity, that actually does what she wants.
And why do we want workers to have higher wages? Why is that important in a basic income world?
Um, in a basic income world, I mean, it's almost not exactly an option. Like, the way I see it is that wages are too low in the non-basic income world. And then when you go into basic income world and you add the basic income, like, wages also rise. Like, it's actually, low wages are actually part of the problem, because they self-reinforce, because they reduce spending, and reduced spending causes the wages to reduce again in the future, so that it kind of keeps both spending and wages low. But when you put the basic income in and fund spending the way it should be, the way that would keep your economy at capacity and keep your factories busy, that would actually bring the returns on capital and the returns on labor way up. Both of these things are way too low right now. And the reason they're too low is because we have all this capital, we have all this labor available, but we don't have money to spend to actually utilize them both, because they substitute for each other.
So you're not you're not arguing that higher wages are necessarily better for people in the basic income world. You're more saying that higher wages are a consequence of having a basic income.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure I agree with that. And a big part of the reason why is that you have to think about what is basic income doing. It's providing a source of money for people, and the source of money that we provide people now comes from kind of expansionary monetary policy that stimulates the financial sector to push money to people through jobs. So the more basic income you have, the less you need to do that other stuff. So there's a substitution of one source of income for another. And like, if you imagine an efficient labor market, then wages are just the amount of money that creates an incentive to do the work. But right now, wages are kind of vastly inflated over that in aggregate, because we're using the labor market as a tool for pushing money to consumers instead of having a basic income.
Right. So I agree that the monetary policy is kind of overused, and that we should reduce that when we put the basic income in. I disagree with you that the monetary policy is effective at raising wages. I don't think it is effective at raising wages any more than it is effective at raising the price of everything else, because labor is just another resource in the economy. So when the Federal Reserve uses monetary policy to lower interest rates and makes capital more easily accessible by corporations, then there's no stipulation on that capital that they have to give it to workers. They will spend it however they would spend it normally. They'll just have more of it to spend. So that, I mean, it would have a supportive effect on everything, including the price of energy, real estate, everything. But it's not it doesn't target labor effectively. Yeah, that's my view.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess this is kind of I don't know if we could kind of prove this in a theoretical way. I know we both have strong intuitions in opposite directions on this point. And for me, it's not just the tightening of the financial sector. That obviously eliminates jobs that or eliminates wages that would otherwise be there if you didn't do that. But and we agree on that. You just feel that more wages would kind of be created that would compensate, that would more than compensate for the loss of the inefficient wages. At least that's my understanding of how.
Yeah, it's kind of a question of, is monetary policy better at raising wages, or is basic income better? Like, which one would be more, have a great effect?
Yeah, I see. That's because that's not how I think about it, because I don't think basic income. So I guess you could imagine basic income in a void where, you hold everything else equal, and the basic income is just adding money to the economy, and then some of that money is coming out in wages, and then wages are higher because of that. I guess that might be your intuition, right?
Um, I, I actually feel like that's like you're. I think you are actually holding everything else equal and putting the basic income in. But I think what I'm saying is that when you put the basic income in, everything else changes. And I think you're holding the total level of income constant, but I don't think it stays constant. I think it changes. And I would argue that the response to the basic income coming in is not that, wages sort of go down to, kind of to let the income in. It's the opposite. It causes wages to also go up when you put the basic income in, because spending went up, and there's a spending multiplier which is greater than one. That spending causes activity, and some of that activity goes back into labor wages. It's that spending labor income loop.
Yeah, I guess we just disagree about the size of that multiplier, because I'm not imagining that the total income stays fixed. I'm just imagining that the increased income from the basic income is going to be higher than the increase in total income. So then the wages have to come down to compensate. But I don't know if we're going to resolve this now. I think, yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. Well, I think the spending multiplier would actually have to be less than one for you to actually get a reduction in labor income when you put your basic income in.
Yeah, so spending multipliers are tricky because the idea is that you spend the money into the economy, and then it turns over some number of times. It gets spent, it goes to someone else and they spend it again or something like that. That's the idea with the spending multiplier. But if you are, and I tend not to think about it in that way, because when you change a lot of these things, you're changing the spending multiplier. And I don't think the spending multiplier is like, oh, there's a spending multiplier, and if you increase, the money, then it all gets multiplied or something like that. Instead, I tend to think of there being a flow of money going from producers to, or from consumers to producers, a flow of goods and services going in the opposite direction. And then the flow of money has a source and it has a destination. And what's happening outside of that little slice of the economy can be really, really complicated. So basic income can be part of the source. And then, maybe when money flows out of the producers, some of it cycles back to consumers, so it can kind of feed back in on itself. And then, that's probably the mechanism that you'd think would happen with the multiplier. Yeah. And then the question is that greater than one? My intuition is that it wouldn't be in a basic income world, but you never know. So yeah.
I think the only spending multipliers that are less than one that people talk about are like when the government is spending money, but it's borrowing money off of private debt markets. So the idea is that, right. Some private investment gets crowded out, something else does not happen because of that spending. And right. So I don't think it.
So you're doing two things at once. But I mean that's actually what I'm saying.
But I guess that's what
with the basic income.
Yeah, with monetary policy.
Exactly.
I guess that's what you think, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Very good.
All right. Let's go to Austin. You have your hand up, Austin.
Hey. So generally kind of agree with Eddie the about the wages thing. What I would say is, like, I think that the overall percentage of income in the economy from wages might drop, and even the total wage bill might drop because people are leaving the labor market. So in Kelton's terms, we would have a tighter labor market, but not by creating more jobs, but by having fewer workers available because people are doing other things with their time, right? And I think there's a fundamental, the philosophical worldview change that happens, which is that people start to value their time and value their leisure and value their mental energy and emotional energy more, right? And so they're less likely to you need to do more to motivate them to sacrifice that for you to make, I don't know, widgets or whatever it is your company does, right? You want someone to come and not spend time with their family, not spend time pursuing their passion, but do this, be a cog in your machine. You're going to have to pay them more for that. And this ties in with this whole idea of stimulus. It's like, well, what at the moment, the way we say is like, well, we need to give money to consumers so they can go out and then they'll spend and then the economy will grow. And it's like, well, you're missing the point, right? The point is that the people have the stuff. The point is that it goes the other way around. The economy should serve the people, and the people should be, which is something I know you agree with, that when we say stimulus, it's missing the point, because production is a means to consumption. Consumption isn't a means to production. And I think that ties in with this basic idea of what do we think is valuable, right? And if we think people are valuable and our time is valuable rather than, GDP growth or some other abstract economic measure, then people are going to be, hopefully people will internalize that. And then they'll say, well, if you want me to do something that's not what I want to do, you're going to have to pay me a significant amount. I'm not going to just take anything because the alternative is not starving.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I like that you brought up the wage level versus the aggregate wages. Usually I'm speaking in terms of aggregate wages rather than wage levels. Wage levels are a little bit trickier because by default, I kind of think about people's time as, everybody has 24 hours in a day, and then it's being paid or not, a certain amount or not. But then a reduction in aggregate wages is also a reduction in kind of the average wage level for people's hours in general, right? Because I think it's really hard to draw a clear line between what counts as labor hours and what doesn't. In order to have a distinction there between wage levels and aggregate wages, you kind of need to draw that distinction. You need to draw the distinction between labor hours and non-labor hours, which we do in our societies. We do, and legally, there's time when you're working and time when you're not working at your job. But that's just a legal construct, right? If we're imagining kind of the more general case, it doesn't have to be that way. It could just be like you spent a little bit of time doing something for a little bit of money, and it's really hard to assign, which money goes with which hours and that kind of thing. So let's go to the next, and you guys both have your hands up. I want to make sure you don't have more to say. Oh, you have a follow-up. There you go.
I actually think it's really easy to say what's wages and what's not, because if there's a contract, it's a specific kind of legal contract, as you say, that covers wages. And I think we can disambiguate that quite easily from, like, if I'm spending, okay, and I think a lot of things that a lot more would be done outside the labor market, right? There'd be a lot of activity that's not jobs going on. People would, like, the example I use of a fully automated economy, right, is, for example, music. Like, we've basically already automated music away to nothing, and farming. And so you have this very small population of professional musicians, very small population of professional farmers, and their work is magnified in productivity by technology. So Childish Gambino records one song once, and 17, it can be played 17 billion times, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody hears it and gets to listen to the music and enjoy it. So, but yet then you still have this whole army of non-professional musicians and people with market gardens and like all of that. And that, but those are definitely not those people are not employed as musicians. They're not employed as farmers. And we can pretty easily sum that up because, especially given our current system, we have, there's tax and reporting. Every time you employ somebody, you have to file a thing to the tax department and say, this is an employment contract, right? And I think the point we both agree that like to step back and get away from the current sort of institutional setup, we want to move from a society where people are extrinsically motivated, where they're motivated by, I have to do this so I can pay my rent, to a society where people are intrinsically motivated, where I'm doing this because I love doing it. And actually, we know from studies that in cognitively difficult tasks, intrinsic motivation like beats the pants off extrinsic motivation, right? You actually perform better if it's something you're interested in. And we all want that. But rather than saying, oh, well, then, wages fall, it's just, I think it would say that the institution of employment becomes ever more marginal in society. And, the people who are doing it become more like Google employees at Google, where you get paid very well, right? And, it's the employees actually have significant power because they can walk away, right? And you wouldn't bother doing it unless it's really worthwhile for both parties, rather than it being the default everywhere all the time. I think there's less disagreement than it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're bringing up an important point about the source of motivation, that a lot of the important stuff that we do is not motivated by money. It might be motivated by, you might be calling it intrinsic motivation, but social incentives, cultural incentives, that kind of thing. And that stuff works. That's how we get most of our stuff done in our lives, especially at small scale, right? But then, there are a few things that for whatever reason don't get done from those kinds of incentives. And that's when you need a labor market. So the labor market is only really for kind of the stuff that isn't going to get done otherwise. And that's kind of how I always think about it. And I think that's the healthy way to think about it. If you start to expect everyone to get a job and be contributing to kind of this large scale market economy, without actually examining whether that's actually, we actually need all that labor, then that's when you start to run into trouble. But yeah, I mean, in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to be paying anyone to do anything at all because people would just do all the right stuff. So wages are almost an indicator. If you're imagining a basic income world, wages are almost an indicator that, for whatever reason, people aren't naturally doing all of the stuff that society needs them to do or wants them to do. That's why I like lower wages, because that's an indicator that people are doing what they're doing, all the amazing things that they're doing without having to be motivated by money in this way. So let's go to the next quote from the article or from the chapter. And then Austin again says lower wages overall, but not per hour. And I just, like the distinction again, like you brought up the important point that in our society, in our legal structure, the way we've set it up, it's easy to tell which hours are labor hours and which ones aren't. But that's just because that's how we've written the contracts. They don't have to be written that way. And I think there's a case to be made, and I would be in favor of this, of creating more flexibility there, and having, like instead of having a minimum wage and then volunteer work is okay, but you can't get paid anything in between, or having like like a distinction between what's a full-time job and a part-time job, or like that kind of thing. It can just all be on a continuum, right? And maybe some contracts are not for a specific number of hours. Maybe it's for, like we need a specific task done. If it takes you 2 days, fine. If it takes you 2 minutes, fine. We're paying you $50 either way, right? Something like that. And then that's hard to map onto the labor hours as well. So I mean, like we do have things set up, legal structure set up and contracts set up so that it's very clear in many contexts. But we didn't have to do that. We didn't have to have it set up that way. And I think in an ideal world, we might not have it that way. There might be a more of a variety of different kinds of labor contracts. So let's see, let's go to the next quote here. The climate stuff. So all the work needed to close the climate deficit will help close the good jobs deficit, and efforts to shore up our communities and cities against the ravages of climate change would be part and parcel of closing the infrastructure deficit. So this is an important point, which is that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in our society. Infrastructure, fighting climate change, all kinds of things, right? So I think, something that MMT proponents like to do is to say, hey, look, there's all this work that needs doing. Hey, there are all these people who need good jobs, decent jobs. Let's, match them up. And then it's win-win for everyone, right? And I think the problem with that thinking is that the very fact that people need good jobs or decent jobs with high enough wages, that kind of thing. The fact that that's even the case is a product of the context in which we put people. The environment in which they're living is an environment that forces them to get a job in order to survive. If you take that away, if you set the basic income high enough, then they don't need good jobs anymore. So then the question becomes, how much basic income do we need to withhold from people in order to get them to do all this important work that we need them to do? How much do we need to lower the basic income in order to have a sufficient amount of labor, working on our infrastructure and fighting climate change and all of that stuff? And that's a very different way of thinking about it. It's not like this group needs this and this group needs this, and we're matching them up. It's more that the amount by which ordinary people need to work is going to be determined by the incentives that we create for them. And ideally, the incentives are going to be set up by the people who need the product of the labor, and you're not going to over-incentivize work or under-incentivize work. So that's why I picked that one. And this one, of course, is kind of a reference to the Green New Deal and other kind of spending and infrastructure programs, the job guarantee, stuff like that MMT people talk about. If you have a high enough basic income, then guaranteeing people jobs is nonsensical, because it's only possible to guarantee people jobs if you have enough money to pay them to do the jobs because you withheld the money from them. So instead of guaranteeing people jobs, you can give people enough money so that only enough people want jobs that actually correspond with the work that needs doing, that kind of thing. So let me see here. Let me see if I can get to the next one. We're getting right through these. We're getting toward the end too. Okay. Here we go. Remember that MMT says the government deficit is always someone else's surplus. And in the US in recent decades, as the government deficit has increased, dollars have flowed disproportionately into the pockets of the wealthy, creating vast distances between them and the rest of America. Such economic inequality is hardly new to America, but in recent years, it's risen to heights not seen since the Gilded Age and the robber barons. So this is kind of highlighting the problem of inequality, or the perceived problem of inequality. This is a tricky one for me, partly because when it comes to incomes, I'm usually thinking in terms of, well, what can people buy? Can they get the things that will make their lives better off? And if someone over, somewhere else has a lot more money, that is not super relevant to this concern, which is kind of my primary concern. But Kelton also brings up an important point, which is about political power, which we've talked about in here before. If someone has a lot of money, they have a lot of political power. I like to say that no amount of taking money away from the rich is going to empower the poor as much as giving money to the poor, and that's true politically. But it's also there is this kind of nagging thing, like, there's such a thing as someone having too much money, and how do you stop that from happening? If one person has, 1,000,000 times as much money as everyone else in the world combined, for example, to kind of take it to an extreme, then there's an imbalance there. There's an imbalance of power. Even if that person has good intentions, they could do the equivalent of, dropping a quarter accidentally on the sidewalk and completely crash the global economy or something like that. So you need some kind of bounds on the system. People often suggest taxes for this purpose. Taxes are tough. They're tough to, depending on what tax you're talking about. Like an income tax is it's not just that it's difficult to enforce. Like people might hide their money somewhere else. You hear that objection a lot. But another issue is that, well, what if people just well, yeah, I mean, so there's the incentive issue. You want people to have an incentive to get rich by producing things that benefit the people. You could still have that with a pretty high income tax, because as long as they're still able to earn something, right, over and above what they had before. Wealth taxes is what's really tricky, because if you have a wealth tax, it creates an incentive for people to get rid of their wealth, so to go out in the world and spend all their money, right? So then that creates potentially problems in the economy as well. So there's a lot of trickiness here. I'll call on you in a second, Austin, but one thing that I've proposed here in the past is finding a way to get rich people to want to give up their money. So sell them something exclusive, that's not something that they can just hold as an asset and treat as another form of money and trade around or something like that. Like maybe you get to spend, a weekend, renting out a national park or something like that. I don't know. There's various ideas. Maybe the space agency sends you to the moon for a moon experience, and you pay a lot more than the resources that went into it. So it's really just a way for the government to suck money away from rich people. But it's also a prestige thing that rich people will want to spend their money on, that kind of thing. So let's see. Go ahead, Austin.
Okay, well, I put my hand up before you said this, but I think the idea of a rich person getting to rent out and have exclusive access to a national park is perhaps the most on-the-nose offensive thing I've heard you say, right? Like, it seems to me that that's an offense to the sense of civic, to the civic fabric, right? You have these things, and that's part of the issue that we're trying to get at here, is when one person has so much power, it becomes not an economic issue, but a social issue. It becomes something where this person is somehow above everybody else, and that puts everybody else on this lower rung, and that's offensive to people to their moral and social sense, right? And I'm not saying that our current moral and social paradigms are perfect and they're going to stay the same forever, but I do think there's something to the all men are created equal thing that you Americans go on about, and I think that this kind of chips. Well, all people rather, not just men, and this chips away at that and undermines it when people so clearly have unequal access. But to switch back to the economic side of things, what you'll say is that people have all this money, it doesn't matter because they're not spending it, and there's so few of them, right? And I think that's kind of true now, because we're so underutilizing our economy, that when Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates gets a $500 million super yacht, it's not like those engineers were going to be building bridges or schools anyhow, right? Like, there's probably latent capacity lying around. But in a basic income world, where we're a calibrated basic income world, where we've raised the basic income as high as it can go, where we've maxed out our resource use to an extent, whatever our level of resource use that we're happy with is, and we're giving everyone as much of a share of that as possible, then when Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates says, well, okay, well, I'm going to spend $500 billion on a private spaceship or a luxury yacht, they're then sucking away resources and skills that could be used elsewhere. And to an extent, not the super rich, but the layer under them, not the few billionaires, but the many thousands of multi-millionaires who have, private tutors and security guards and drivers and 5 houses. They are competing with ordinary people for resources, right? So my wife and I were literally evicted from our house last year because the landlord wanted to renovate it and then put it on the market as an Airbnb, right? So it becomes a luxury good for the wealthy rather than a basic good for ordinary people. And that is, I say ordinary people and the wealthy, like the people who are renting it won't be that much wealthier than me, even, right? Like we're not super poor or anything, but we're just, we're not, what we could pay as weekly rent didn't add up to what he could get for a few weekends in the holidays where he's charging, through the nose for it. So I think there is more of it. I do like this idea of separating wealth taxes and income taxes. That's something that I think you've brought me around to some extent, because because if everyone behaved like Warren Buffett, if every billionaire behaved like Warren Buffett and had like a sort of, or even Elon Musk apparently does this, like they don't live particularly lavish lifestyles. Like, they go to restaurants and they have a nice car, but they don't have super yachts, and they don't have like this ostentatious, conspicuous super consumption, which to me doesn't even sound like that much fun. Like the point of having a boat surely is that you get to drive the boat, not that you're like sitting in an armchair giving orders to somebody else who goes down to the engine room and they get to drive the boat. Like, it's a weird thing, but I think you can't sort of shrug it off. But it does kind of make sense to me that you could say, well, the only thing we're going to tax is income. So as long as you're keeping your money in shares and it's part of this economy that's bouncing around, then we, and it's part of this economic game over there. You're not actually consuming it, so your wealth is this abstract control of the company. Then that might be okay, and then we would have a different set of rules, like antitrust rules, to prevent you getting too much. Like, so the way of stopping someone from dominating an industry and having too much power would be slightly different. But even there, I feel like you can have a belt and suspenders situation where you have multiple ways of preventing one person from gaining too much power, and keeping the market competitive and making sure that there's you don't have these people who end up with such immense status, right? Because status is the other thing, right? Like even without things, just one person having so much status is somehow lowers the status of other people, right? And creates a society that I think a lot of people have a sense that there's something sort of sick about our society, with where we have these fantasies of wealth and the Kardashians and hip hop video clips, blah blah blah. There's all this obsession with luxury that's somewhat unhealthy, right? And I think having this, there's something toxic about it. And anyhow, I think I've rambled a bit, but I think the main place we disagree is where that I think the consumption of the rich can impact the ability of the poor to consume. Even now, with an underutilized economy and with a maxed out economy, that would be more of a problem, because there wouldn't be because now we could, just build more houses, right? We could, get a bunch of 3D printers and 3D print a bunch of houses and apartments and have the government or whoever lease them cheaply, and that would affect the housing market. But there is a point at which we'd be like, okay, we can't use up any more land because of environmental concerns or whatever. We've actually maxed out what's available, and then inequality becomes even more important.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think, when people have a lot of money, when they have disproportionately more money than everyone else, they're going to want to find a way to use that money potentially, or some of them will want to find a way to use that money to kind of like show off that they're better than people. So this kind of offends kind of the sensibilities like you were talking about before. Maybe renting a national park is not the best way to do that. But the idea here that we kind of want to be going for is figuring out how to do that with a minimum of impact on everyone else. How can rich people, show off their richness and use up their richness in ways that are minimally harmful to society? And I think that's kind of, there's a lot of different ways you could think about maybe setting that up. Bethany says that she's read that corporate taxes have a big impact on wealth inequality because of the impact on stocks. That makes a lot of sense. I think, basic income itself will as well in that sense, especially the transition from not having basic income to basic income, and the the kind of concomitant increase in interest rates that will drive down asset prices during the transition. But there's also, there's the question of what happens during the transition, and then there's the question of once you're in that basic income world, how do you prevent like runaway inequality or wealth or something like that. So this is a good discussion, you guys. Thanks for coming out tonight. Next week we are doing the very last chapter, chapter 8 of the deficit myth, building an economy for the people, and that's going to get into some of the job guarantee stuff among other things. So looking forward to that.